Hi, it's Dwyer. Hi, it's Dwyer. GamblersAdvisory.com, DwyerBoxingNews.com. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Let's talk about a couple of fights first, then I want to get to Enzo Calzaghe's comments that Carl Froch, in his opinion, is not a great fighter. First, there is a fight in the heavyweight division that I think you need to know about. Oliver McCall's son, Elijah McCall, who's trained by one of boxing's better up-and-coming trainers, Nate Jones, has only one loss on his record. He also has a lot of punching power. But he's actually fighting a guy I think is underrated. He's one of the guys I believe you need to know about, and his name is Andy Ruiz Jr., right? This guy is highly skilled, in my opinion. He's an unbeaten young heavyweight. He's slick. He's a croucher. He can bend at the waist. He throws hooks, but more importantly, he puts punches together. He is a combination puncher in the heavyweight division. And while he has average foot speed, the guy throws very nice short punches. He can fight inside. He can smother a mid-range hooker. And he actually is pretty good defensively. I like Andy Ruiz Jr. over Elijah McCall. Elijah McCall has the punching power. The problem, though, in my opinion, is that McCall, who has been knocked out before, he was knocked out once, right? In a fight in which he dropped the other guy multiple times. But McCall gets hit too often. I believe defense is part of the game, and I think if you have defensive lapses and you're facing a combination puncher, you're in for a long night. So I don't know how the casinos have priced this one, but I can tell you if I had to make one bet in this one, it would be on Andy Ruiz Jr. Let's talk about another fight. And this fight is the UK's Darren Barker. Keep in mind, he got knocked out by Sergio Martinez. And he's facing Kerry Hope. And if you recall, Kerry Hope is the boxer who actually ended Prox's unbeaten run. Here's what you need to know about the fight. Here's why I believe Darren Barker is the clear pick here. Darren Barker has only lost to Sergio Martinez. Also, Barker is bigger than Kerry Hope, can keep Kerry Hope at the end of a jab, and Barker is the only one in this fight with any semblance of power. Darren Barker knocks out 58% of his opponents. Kerry Hope, by contrast, knocks out less than 5%. You really need to view that Proxa fight as an outlier, right? Now, while Kerry Hope is good defensively, works well behind a jab, and can fight inside, understand that Darren Barker in some respects is like Andre Ward. He comes from a fighting family. He can fight many styles. You want to get inside on Darren Barker? Darren Barker can fight you inside. Darren Barker can fight you with his back up against the ropes. Quite frankly, in my opinion, Darren Barker is underrated. I like Darren Barker in that fight. Now let's talk about Enzo Calzaghe's comments. Now I don't mean to pick on Carl Froch in the slightest. Let me just say this. People forget I picked Froch over a then unbeaten Jean Pascal. I picked Froch in the United States when no one knew who he was over Jermaine Taylor, who was a much more known fighter. I've taken Froch in big fights. Now, Enzo Calzaghe claims that Froch is a good fighter, not a great fighter. Of course, Enzo has a dog in the race. He's the father of Joe Calzaghe. Right? Joe Calzaghe and Carl Froch have been having a Cold War for a very long time. Froch when he was lesser known, wanted to fight Calzaghe. He thought he could beat Calzaghe, who of course retired unbeaten, his last two fights being a victory over Bernard Hopkins in the United States and Roy Jones in New York City. Well, here's what I want people to think about. If we're talking about great, and I mean great, well, understand that word really has to be limited to the fighters who you're looking at, who you really start to wonder whether anybody in the history of the sport could beat that guy at their best. Right? That has to be the question. If you're talking about all-time great fighter, and understand, some of these guys who have hit the highest altitude have had holes in their game, right? But if you're really going to throw the word great out there, the fighter really has to be the kind of fighter who you really wonder, could anyone beat him at this moment? Now, to me, it's a very short list. Very short list. The guys on this list, and my list is not comprehensive. Every fight fan has their list. The guys on this list, really, some of them were only in their prime for maybe a couple of years. Some of these guys had holes in their game even in their prime and were later exposed in their careers. But for, let's say, a 2-year period, these guys were so effective, even with the holes in their game, right? The athleticism offset their deficiencies to such an extent that you had to ask yourself, well, could anyone ever beat this guy in the history of the sport? I'll name some of the guys who, in my opinion, fall in this category, right? These are guys who you would say, wow, he's great, right? Prime Roy Jones, not Roy today, sorry Roy, but Roy in the 1990s. Let me also point out too, that when we talk about great, I'm not necessarily saying that these guys fought the best competition. I'm not saying that at all. Some of these guys, like Roy Jones in particular, clearly did not fight the best competition for stretches of their career, right? I know Jones fought Hopkins really before Hopkins was Hopkins. I know Jones fought Tony when Tony was unbeaten. We'll give him that. But there are other guys, Swenaki, for example, who Jones did not fight. But my point is simply, prime Roy Jones was so fast, had a left hook from heaven, that even though as you watched him, you wonder if he had the fundamentals beneath the athleticism, you did have to ask yourself whether anyone at, let's say, 168, 175, could actually deal with the hand speed, deal with the foot speed, deal with the punches from weird angles, just deal with the entire presence. Another guy, Mike Tyson, late 1980s. Now let me just say, there are many heavyweights in history who were more fundamentally sound than Mike Tyson, right? I believe Buster Douglas beats him from the outside behind a jab, right, with an uppercut mixed in. And of course, Evander Holyfield beats him from the inside, right? Putting his head literally up on Mike's face. That first Holyfield fight, if you look at the last 2 rounds of that fight, Mike Tyson is owned. But understand, the Mike Tyson who literally runs through Trevor Burbank, blows out Michael Spinks, has Bone Crusher Smith hugging him to death, right? Blows out Marvis Frazier. When you look at that Mike Tyson and you factor in the two-handed punching power, the hand speed, the fact that Tyson's coming in low and can throw uppercuts, the fact that it was just hard to control Tyson to the point where, Tyson was dodging any jab on the way in. Then while I'll say that Lennox Lewis, for example, had more skills, right? Tyson's talent for that late 80s period of time, in my opinion, puts him on the all-time great list in terms of outlier talent. It's not Lewis, who I asked the question of, could anyone in history of the sport beat this guy at his best? We asked that question of Tyson, right? Even though the guys fought well after Mike Tyson's prime, right? Another guy who you obviously have to ask this question of, Ray Robinson, right? Now, I know there are those, especially at welterweight. Now, I know there are those who will point out that Robinson lost to Jake LaMotta. And for the hardcore among you, they'll point out that Gene Fullmer, who fought a lot like Jake LaMotta, beat Robinson multiple times later in Robinson's career. But understand, if you're looking at Ray Robinson, don't just look at his dominance at welterweight. Look at his dominance in the amateurs. Also, look at the weight gap between himself and the Raging Bull, LaMotta. They weren't even in the same weight class, right? An argument can be made that Ray Robinson, particularly at welter, is the gold standard in the sport, right? I think he falls in this category of, could anybody in the history of the sport beat him at his best? Let me name a couple of modern fighters, guys still in the game, but both, in my opinion, a little past their prime. Manny Pacquiao's hand speed was so off the charts, especially when he fought Oscar De La Hoya. The Manny Pacquiao who enters the ring that night after destroying David Diaz, and keep in mind, Manny Pacquiao was just visiting Diaz's weight class, takes on the champ, destroys him. Pacquiao was so fast and moved so well, moved better than he does now. Let me just tell you, the legs are the first to go, right? I would say that Manny Pacquiao who beat Oscar De La Hoya, you really had to ask yourself, could anybody in the history of the sport beat this Manny Pacquiao, right? Because the hand speed could hang with anybody in boxing history. Another guy who falls into this category, Floyd Mayweather, right? Sadly, if Pacquiao fights Mayweather, I believe they're both a little past their prime now. But if you look at Floyd Mayweather, especially when he fights Diego Corrales, that Mayweather, quite frankly, in my opinion, could hang with anybody in the history of the sport at that weight class. In fact, I'll tell you what I'd love to see. Floyd Mayweather against Ray Robinson. I think that's an interesting fight, especially if it's prime on prime, because prime Mayweather had legs to follow you around the ring. He might not anymore. But the thing with Ray Robinson that people need to realize is Ray Robinson could get backed up against the ropes, right? I think Floyd falls into this category. Let me name a few other guys who I've asked the question while looking at the highlights. Prime Salvador Sanchez. Understand, this is the fighter who is Roy Jones's idol, right? A boxer's boxer. I thought Sanchez, who beat Azuma Nelson, Nelson's boxing Hall of Famer, right? Sanchez beat Danny Little Red Lopez, right? Sanchez, put it this way. Sanchez beat Wilfredo Gomez. This is a name you need to know. Another guy who you really have to ask yourself, could anyone in the history of the sport have beaten him? Prime, mid-1960s, Muhammad Ali. Right? Like Roy Jones, there are holes. Ali didn't really go to the body much. Ali, his defense was just leaning. But the athleticism, he was a superior athlete at heavyweight. He moved like a middleweight. His foot speed was better than my cat's, right? He threw a jab. He had blinding hand speed at heavy. I believe if this Ali faces Joe Louis, the Louis who took on Max Schmeling, I don't think Louis would remotely have the foot speed to keep up. I think that fight would be as bad a mismatch as Ali against Cleveland Williams, right? Well, just to sum up, let me just say, Prime Pernell Whitaker also belongs on this list, right? Where you look at his defense and you just have to ask yourself, would an opponent be able to hit him? I think it's an open question on what happens if Pernell faces Ray Robinson or Floyd Mayweather, right? Does Carl Froch belong on this list? I'd say no, because this list is so exclusive. I'm sure there are other fighters. Quite frankly, I personally would put the Vitaly Klitschko, who takes out Kirk Johnson, on this list. I believe Vitaly, if you look at his feet, just look at how much ground he covers, actually moves better than Joe Louis, quite frankly, and is one of those boxing savants whose defense is underrated because he's sticking his hand out blocking shots. Now, this list, with the standard of could anyone in the history of the sport beat this guy at his best, is just too exclusive, I believe, for most. I put Carl Froch more on the list of guys who are great fighters who have made themselves into great fighters without having that 100-mile-an-hour fastball, right? In other words, you look at Bernard Hopkins. Now, don't get me wrong. Bernard is a cut above Carl Froch in terms of his career. Hopkins, if you go through his career, he's one of, in my opinion, the three best middleweights in history. Carlos Monzon, Marvelous Marvin Hagler being the other two. But it's like a guy like a Bernard Hopkins or a Hagler. These are guys who literally, through discipline, were able to maximize their skills. But make no mistake, there's a difference between them and someone like Mike Tyson. Because while Mike Tyson in his prime may have been fighting other contenders in back alleys just due to disagreements, those in the 1980s remember that he fought Mitch Green, then a contender, outside Dapper Dan's in Harlem one night, right? While Mike Tyson may have been staying out late and, fighting guys and not really training as hard as he should, juggling trainers, while Mike Tyson may have had issues, understand that Mike Tyson's talent was beyond a Bernard Hopkins' talent, right? Compare and contrast Bernard to Roy Jones. Bernard's the much better technician than Roy Jones, much better. But Roy Jones had a 100-mile-an-hour fastball. Bernard has no punch remotely resembling Jones's left hook, right? Life's unfair. The talented guys might disrespect the sport, might be out late at night, they might be dating models and being at the club late like Carlos Monzon. The bottom line is, in the ring, if you're talking about great middleweights with talent, Monzon's on the list for a reason different than Hopkins, right? Monzon may have been out late partying, but few guys had the punching power of Carlos Monzon. right? While Carl Froch has a punch, I put him more with the Marvin Haglers, the the Bernard Hopkinses, you know, not on the Ray Robinson list. The Ray Robinson lists are for the elite few who, for whatever reason, for a 2-year period, at least, have just hit a level where, as you're watching Manny Pacquiao's hand speed, you just say to yourself, how would anyone, including Ray Robinson, be able to deal with this? Right? I haven't asked that question too often, and I haven't asked that question of Carl Froch. Now, let me just say, Carl Froch does have an opportunity to get himself closer to Hopkins and, Marvin Hagler, right? He just has to clean up the loose ends. He lost to McCall Kessler. He just needs to revisit that. Quite frankly, I think Froch wins the rematch. He just needs to revisit that fight with McCall Kessler. He lost to Andre Ward. He's going to have to eventually come full circle, fight Andre Ward, and beat him. Right? If Carl Froch can do that, then an argument can be made that he's the best super middle of his time. Right? If he's unable to do that, then we can't give him that designation. Especially not when we have Andre Ward as one of the best in the sport pound for pound, who has already fought and beaten not just Froch, but also the other man who beat Froch, McCall Kessler. Right? And so it's interesting. But I will say this, because Froch lacks hand speed, because Froch as an athlete isn't an outlier like Pacquiao, like Mayweather, like Robinson, like Jones, like Ali, like Whitaker. I just don't see, because Froch's calling card, punching power, isn't as stunning as, let's say, Mike Tyson. I just don't see how Froch makes it to this list. Let me just say, too, Joe Calzaghe, it's a little bit harder because Calzaghe's hand speed was off the page. And keep in mind, Calzaghe has a big one-up on Froch in that Calzaghe fought unbeaten McCall Kessler and beat him. Right? Froch fought McCall Kessler. I understand one fought him in the UK, the other fought him in Denmark. I agree. I'll even go further and say that Froch-Kessler fight could have gone the other way on the scorecards. I'll agree with both of those statements. But Calzaghe has the hand speed, or had the hand speed, that made you go, wow. And he actually beat McCall Kessler. Right? Froch never had the hand speed Calzaghe had. Right? Froch doesn't have that outlier trait. And, of course, Froch lost to McCall Kessler, and he lost to Kessler after Kessler had already lost to Andre Ward, right? And so I'll say this, Carl Froch is a very good fighter. He has a chance to be the best in his weight class of his era. It's going to be a little uphill for him. Could he be one of the best in hit? Could he be on the short list of, could anybody in the history of the sport beat this guy at his best? I would say no, simply because the guys on this list are so unusual, right? Let me know what you think. Leave your comments for me here online. Let me also say, too, that, you have a lot of great fighters who've been great in history. As I mentioned before, Lennox Lewis, for example, who I would not put on the list of could anybody in the history of the sport beat this guy at his best. Simply because I don't think Lewis, even prime Lewis, against, let's say, an Ali, had the foot speed to keep up with Muhammad Ali, or would be able to handle Ali's counters, right? You can disagree with me, obviously. Let me hear from you. Let's have the conversation. Thanks for watching.